All right, here we are in part 2. I'm guessing there's going to be a part 3 as well as we go along here. Okay, so in the last video, we talked about some global trends. We talked quite a bit about China in particular. So obviously there was quite a bit of growth in China. However, the huge, enormous growth in the 20th century happened in Africa. Okay, Africa is now about 48% Christian. Okay, and there's some realities we need to talk about here. So up on the screen, I have a quote from Esther Mambo in her article that she wrote on women and African Christianity. And she describes these two overarching realities, okay? She says, in the background, the all-pervasive reality of colonialism. And then the second influence, which was very present in the foreground, was the missionary movement. Within the large scheme of things, the work among women in Africa was stumbled upon rather than thought through and executed, okay? Moreover, it was the arrival of women missionaries from the second half of the 19th century, which accelerated the ideology of women's work. Okay, so this women's work was very much secondary. Okay. And often these missionaries brought with them real ideas of like Victorian Western ideas of gender, and kind of put that on the people, even though that wasn't necessarily their culture at all. Okay, so that's another thing that kind of went on there. So Africa, like Asia, there was and continues to be Western missionary presence in Africa. Okay, there has been tremendous growth, but a lot of the success of African Christianity can be seen through African initiated churches, or AICs, as they're called for short. And this is an area in which women are particularly dominant, actually. Okay, a lot of AICs were founded by women. There's a lot of leaders who are women, and actually a majority of the members are too. Okay, so much so that it's been called a women's movement. Okay, so as a general rule, you will see more women leading in these AICs than in Christian denominations that were kind of brought from the West, okay? Though women's leadership is increasing in many places in Africa, okay? That does not mean that women are equal leaders throughout Africa. Doesn't mean women are equal leaders through the world, all right? As in most places, by and large, women are marginalized in church leadership there as in elsewhere. However, there is this emerging field of African women theologians. Through ecumenical organizations, women theologians and leaders within the church in Africa have worked together for greater leadership opportunities for other women. The Ecumenical Decade of Churches in Solidarity with Women, which ran from 1988 to 1998, was set up by the World Council of Churches, and it aimed to empower women to challenge oppressive structures in the global community. This was a point when a number of African Christian denominations started having the conversation about women's ordination. Okay, and then in 1989, another significant ecumenical group was formed. A group of approximately 70 African women met in Ghana to create a forum in which they could reflect, analyze on their experiences. Okay, and they call themselves the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. Okay, notably, this group did not use the word feminist, but they did highlight the fact that they were all African. Okay, the founder of this group is Mercy Amba Aduyoye, okay, who is kind of known as the mother of African women's theology, okay? In her book, Introducing African Women's Theology, she explains that through their theological heritage, though their theological heritage is made up of European and American theologies of various types, including missionary and feminist womanist theologies, African women theologians take a critical distance from them as their priority is to communicate African women's own understanding, okay? So she is accepting, like, yes, there is this theological lineage that we've taken, but we are doing something different. We are doing something unique within our own context, okay? The Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians included not just Christian theologians, but it was inclusive of women in indigenous religions and Islam as well. well. Okay, the main aim of the circle was to encourage lay and ordained women to study and to write theology, which would impact churches. Okay, so on Moodle, I actually put up a lecture by Oduyoye. She gave it in 2018. It's pretty lengthy. Okay, so it is an optional watch, but I thought you might enjoy it. It's a pretty good lecture. Okay, so if you have time, it is up there. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. I want to focus a little bit more on kind of this idea of a century of strife. We're going to spend just a brief amount of time on this because we talk about this a fair amount in history too. And then a little bit more time on the century of hope and some reform movements. Okay. So I really, even though we talk about this in history too, I really do want to emphasize like this critical aspect of the 20th century experience is suffering, okay, especially in the first half of the century. By all means, though, the second half of the century cannot be described as peaceful by any means, okay. You know, sometimes you'll hear the quote that there are more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than all other centuries combined. To be honest, there's like absolutely no way to prove that. I mean, really, like those things are impossible to judge definitively when you're looking at history. Okay. But when you start thinking of like the Armenian genocide, the Nazi genocide, which of course disproportionately affected the Jewish population, but other people died in that as well. You know, suppression of religion under, you know, Stalinism and other forms of communism, the Rwandan genocides, persecutions in the Middle East and various other places, okay? We're looking at a lot of people that died, okay? So I just want to name that and hold that up there. And you know, with these events, you know, like in the world wars, all right, women weren't necessarily combatants. There actually were cases like Russia had all women troops, but that was unusual, okay? So usually women didn't die in combat. But actually, like the Second World War, there were more civilian deaths than combat deaths, okay? And those disproportionately affected women, okay? So I'm going to leave that there, but I just wanted to recognize that. And then I want to move to something very closely related to that, which is the peace movement. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of it, and then I'm going to give you two examples of these really effective grassroots peace movements started by women. Okay. So the peace movement really has its roots in kind of this Western 19th century reform movements, like we were talking about the other week, okay? And you had women working both kind of inside and outside political movements to fight for lasting peace, okay? You know, as early as the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, you have people calling for peace. You know, you have Methodist Julia Ward Howe calling for a Mother's Day of peace. In the late 1800s, you have a number of peace organizations being established in Europe. Understandably, like with World War I, which, you know, if it's on this side of it and after all the other wars after it, I mean, World War I was so terrible, and it was supposed to be the war to end all wars, if you remember. And so people are increasingly concerned about being armed, about all this stuff. Okay, so you see a bump there. And so like Jane Addams, who's actually much better known for Hull House and her work in settlement houses, actually won the Nobel Prize in 1931, not for that stuff, but for her work in international disarmament after World War I and her efforts for international peace. Okay, for the World Disarmament Conference in 1932, various women's movements had collected 8 million signatures from 50 countries asking for universal disarmament. You know, Dorothy Day with the Catholic Worker Movement, she faced a lot of backlash for using her paper to kind of, you know, stand against the Second World War. She later became a really important voice against Vietnam and nuclear disarmament, okay, later in the 60s, okay. But some of the most powerful and influential movements for peace were actually grassroots campaigns to stop like a particular violent conflict or an oppressive regime, okay. And I'm going to talk about two of these, the mothers of the Plaza movement in Argentina and the women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace movement in Liberia. Liberia. Okay, so first up, I want to talk a little bit about the mothers of the Plaza, or Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. Okay, so in 1976, the Argentine military, under the leadership of General Jorge Rafael Videla, overthrew the government and launched a campaign that they called the War Against Subversion. Okay, the mission of this war against subversion was to wipe out all vestiges of the previous regime. Okay. Over the course of 7 years, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Generally, they just simply disappeared. No arrests, no charges. They just vanished, okay? Most of the victims were young. The vast majority were under the age of 35. Okay, they were university students, high school students, young workers. All right, some had ties to political organizations, but most were just taken because of like an unlucky association or a chance. Okay, a disproportionate number of these victims were Jewish as well. Okay, so it was this time of terror and fear. Okay, so from like 1976 to 1982, they basically shut down political opposition, all right? The presses were silent on this, okay? It was this reign of terror. And the lone voice of public opposition actually came from a really unlikely source. It wasn't from students, it wasn't from rebels, it was from mothers, okay? Mothers marched every Sunday, and then later it was every Thursday, in front of the presidential palace, or the Casa Rosada, and they were demanding to know what happened to their children, okay? They wore white scarves embroidered with the name of their children, symbolizing, the scarves were supposed to like symbolize their child's diapers, and they carried photographs of their children. Okay, this activism was not without risk, okay? I want to make that very, very clear. Some of the mothers were murdered by the government. Some were threatened. Some were, they were harassed. So the woman who founded it, and then a couple of nuns were murdered. This public display of bravery and suffering began to draw international attention to this brutal war of repression that the government had been waging. So even though the Argentine papers were pretty silent on it, this started getting a lot of international press. It kind of brought to light the much too cozy relationship between the Argentine government and like the U.S. government, which was pretty instrumental in trying to get this dismantled. Okay, so in 1983, the military did give up control of the government to a civilian government. Okay, years later, former military officials came forward and actually did admit what had happened, and because there was initial excitement, like maybe we'll find these people again, but they had all been murdered by the regime, okay, secretly. So very sad story, but these women were instrumental in kind of taking down this regime, okay. The next story I want to talk about for a grassroots kind of anti-violence campaign is the Liberian Civil War and Lema Gabawi's role in kind of stopping this, okay? So in 2003, just to kind of set the scene, a group of Liberian women traveled to Ghana to pressure warring factions in the Second Liberian War, which ran from 1999 to 2003, to come to a peace agreement, okay? When talks stalled, Gabawi and a number of other women, about 200 other women, literally blockaded the representatives of then the president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, who was later tried for war crimes at The Hague, and other rebel warlords, and barred them from leaving their meeting room until they figured something out, okay? This moment proved to be pivotal in the peace process, okay? This came after years of conflict in which the country suffered tremendously. And this conflict is particularly notable for its extensive use of child soldiers on both sides of the conflict. So let me tell you a little bit about Gabawi and how this came about. She was a very unlikely leader, all right? She was only 17 years old when the first Liberian Civil War broke out, which was in 1987, okay? You know, she had planned to go to college and do all that, and everything everything was interrupted by the violence. Okay. In her autobiography, she talks about seeking refuge in a church with other women, only for the soldiers to come in and kill everybody. She escaped, obviously. Mass death. She and her family ended up in this refugee camp in Ghana temporarily, but she came back to Liberia only to suffer just a series of kind of personal and political violence. Okay. You know, in addition to this war, she was in abusive relationships. She was living in poverty. She, you know, had the hardships of like mothering children during, you know, this horrible civil war. Okay. Like she gives this account at one point of sleeping in a hospital for a week because she didn't have the money to pay her bill to leave and no one came and got her. Okay, so this is kind of her experiences during the war. All right. So after the first of the civil wars ended in 1996, she trained to be a trauma counselor, okay, eventually earning a degree in 2001. You know, she saw the trauma that women faced from the violence and the sexual violence committed towards them, but also these kids that had been child soldiers, okay, so she was working with both of these groups. There. Okay. So when the second Civil War broke out in 1999, where systematic rape and other brutalities were used as a terror technique in an already like very devastated society, she was working as a trauma counselor and she was becoming increasingly kind of connected with peace organizations like the West African Network for Peace Building. And she really understood like the importance of women in this fight for peace. Okay. And so she helped organize the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace movement. And this was an interreligious organization of both Christian and Muslim women with the goal of bringing peace to the nation. Okay. And religion was not just kind of a means to an end for Gabawi. She was a very, very deeply religious person. In 2002, she fell asleep at her desk at work and had a dream in which God told her that she needed to gather the women of the country and pray for peace. And she understood this to be a divine call. Okay. So under Gabawi's leadership, thousands of women actually staged pray-ins, nonviolent protests demanding reconciliation and peace talks, okay? Their protests included things like threats of curse and even a sex strike. This is pretty interesting. And later referring to the sex strike, Gabawi admits that this has no practical effect, but it was extremely valuable in gaining media attention to what they were doing, okay? So, you know, they were a group of women that were just exhausted of 14 years of violence. And in the end, like their efforts were extremely successful. Within weeks of their Ghana sit-in amongst the peace talk, Charles Taylor was pushed into exile and a peace treaty was signed. You know, a resolution for traditional government was brought forth. This led to the election of the first woman head of state in Africa ever elected in 2005. Okay. So Gabawi, she's still alive. She continues to be an activist after the war ended. She actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And I have it's like a 1-minute clip of her getting her Peace Prize on Moodle. I don't think she even talks in it, but it's, you know, if you want, it's a minute, you can watch it. All right. So those are two of many stories that I find particularly moving myself and I wanted to share with you. So I'm going to wrap up this video and then we'll have a part 3, which is dealing with kind of primarily women's ordination next. All right. Thanks, everybody.